Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. Today, I'll be answering the question that I get asked often by people who are usually not in the birth world. What are we rebelling against? What is the Great Birth Rebellion rebelling against? Well, I'll tell you what we're rebelling against. So when writing my PhD thesis between 2010 and 2014, I stumbled upon this term, authoritative knowledge. It was the first time I'd ever heard it, and once reading about it, I couldn't believe that I hadn't been introduced to this before, because it represents the biggest problem that birthing women and maternity care workers face today. Don't go. I'm going to explain it all. I know they're big words, and you probably think if you haven't heard about authoritative knowledge before, you will fine before it, you'll be fine after it. But I'm about to blow your mind and explain why you're feeling the way you do about the maternity care system. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably already know something is wrong. And understanding authoritative knowledge is going to help you understand why you have those feelings. Authoritative knowledge is defined as the knowledge that society agrees counts and the knowledge that is right or considered right in a particular situation. So the current authoritative knowledge about birth in society and the message that society would want us to believe is that birth is dangerous. And if you want to be kept safe during this very dangerous event, we need to have an expert care provider who is educated through a university or college and who works in a place that has all the gadgets and tools and machines that have been invented for them to use so that they can keep you safe from all the terrible things that might happen to us or to you and our babies during childbirth. This is the dominant message. This is the authoritative knowledge about birth that we are led to believe. This is the dominant message that holds authority in most societies today in the modern world. This is the authoritative message that has been embedded in our brains about birth. And if we think differently to that, we are labelled as rebels because we are thinking differently to what the authoritative knowledge says we should be thinking. This authoritative message that birth is dangerous and that it needs an expert and that those experts can only keep you safe in a hospital is the reason why governments won't properly fund home birth programs. It's the reason why Australian midwives are having trouble getting indemnity insurance to work at home. This authoritative message is the reason why support for birth choices out of a hospital setting are lacking and why big organisations run by obstetricians fight in government for the continued subjugation of midwives. It's why women who free birth are judged unfairly by society, and it's why your friends and family don't understand your decision to have a home birth. This subliminal messaging is why you have never considered giving birth anywhere other than a hospital or working anywhere else other than a hospital. This authoritative knowledge has been strategically placed in the collective subconscious by decades of intentional societal brainwashing. A hallmark of authoritative knowledge is essentially subjective. And so authoritative knowledge isn't necessarily correct, but it has power. And its power is that it's the knowledge that the majority of people believe counts. And it's the knowledge that the majority of people believe holds authority. Authoritative knowledge is the knowledge that controls decision-making around the birth process. It's not necessarily true, it's just the knowledge that holds the most authority. So understanding this concept of authoritative knowledge helps us to understand how the medical establishment has taken and kept hold of birth. They've been able to establish themselves as the ones who hold the knowledge about birth, and in a medicalized context, ownership of the artifacts and the gear and the equipment and the tools that I mentioned that are used to manage labour gives a visual display of who in the room possesses the authoritative knowledge, and consequently, who in the room holds the decision-making power. Because if you hold the authoritative knowledge, demonstrated by the holding of the equipment, you also hold the decision-making power. This is how birth care has been intentionally set up, and it was designed this way to monopolize the management of birth and control women's births and control birth workers. Society has said the only people with the authority to attend and manage birth are the ones that we train through our formal institutions, who will only learn what we want them to know. We'll tell them what we want them to believe about birth through this formalized training, and then we'll make it so that they can't work anywhere else but in hospitals. This is why it's so hard for us private midwives to work out of hospital, and why we have to fight so hard just to get something basic like professional indemnity insurance, because they don't want us to work in a way that challenges the authoritative knowledge. Then, after training the experts through the formalized institutions and then having them work in hospitals, we then perpetuate the message that birth is dangerous by putting women in the less than ideal circumstances for birth, like in a hospital. We heard from Sarah Buckley not long ago about the physiological needs of a woman for her labour to work properly. We know that birthing in a hospital lacks many of the physiological needs that a woman has when trying to give birth. And then when her body doesn't function physiologically in these less than ideal venues, we tell women that they were lucky. They were lucky that we were there to rescue her and her baby from her birth and from the danger of birth. And when the authoritative knowledge tells women enough that birth is dangerous and that the experts can save them, and then the birthing woman turns to her caregivers for information about her well-being and the well-being of her baby, she'll lose faith in her own knowledge system, because there is another knowledge system that's considered more authoritative than her own. So instead of leaning into her own authoritative, intuitive understanding or cognitive understanding or intellectual understanding of her own body, she'll elect to defer those decisions and that knowledge to the birthing expert. So she elects for CTG monitoring instead of tapping into her intuitive knowledge about the well-being of her baby. She dismisses her own intuition and accepts the knowledge of the experts, even if it doesn't feel right. She puts herself in the good girl role and doesn't speak up because society has told her that if she does reject the recommendations of the birth expert, and if she does reject authoritative knowledge about birth, that she is putting herself in danger. The woman learns that her intuitive knowledge and her ability to think for herself has less value and less authority because society has prioritized medical knowledge of birth over the intuitive knowledge of women and mothers. Over time, the mother's reliance on medical knowledge to determine the well-being of herself and her baby overshadows her own intuitive ability to know her baby and her knowledge of her baby. And her knowledge of her baby is diminished or rendered illegitimate by medical authorities. So what are we rebelling against? We are rebelling against medicalized authoritative knowledge that considers itself superior to the woman's own intuitive knowledge and to other alternative ways of knowing. Because you see, midwives and birth workers also have intuitive ways of knowing. We have a sense of what's happening to a woman in our care that we can tap into if we give ourselves permission to give our intuitive knowledge permission to have a place at the knowledge table. But trusting in other ways of knowing is rebellious. It goes against the modern authoritative knowledge about birth. Today's authoritative knowledge prioritizes medical ways of caring for birthing women, and it prioritizes hospitals as the safest place, and it actively seeks to discredit other ways of knowing and other birthing options. Establishing and maintaining authoritative knowledge is intentional and strategic. They want to keep this knowledge in a place of power and subjugate every other way of knowing in order to hold on to that power. A way to hold on to power is to keep people in fear. And the current risk discourse about birth, which is perpetuated by this medical culture, tells us that giving birth is risky and that hospitals are the safest place to give birth. When someone is frightened, if you offer them a remedy to their fear, you have power over them. They're relying on you to rescue them from a thing that they fear. But in an article by Andrew Bissett's 2016, he suggests that the risks associated with pregnancy and birth are low prevalence phenomena. However, there is an obstetric tendency towards an emphasis on risk. He suggests that when presented with the range of ways that pregnancy and birth can go wrong, women begin to feel that pregnancy is indeed dangerous. And perpetuating fear by promoting risk is an effective strategy to position doctors as the saviours from the perceived dangers of childbirth. It also allows the birthing community to exist in a heightened sense of alarm, and it increases their willingness to attend hospitals. There's an author, Scamell, who wrote in 2016, and this was called the scare factor in this article. And authors argue that medical professionals gain control by inventing risk. For anyone out there who's interested in psychology, you might also be aware of the work of Foucault, whose work described the medical gaze. And the medical gaze describes how certain conditions or behaviours are looked at through a medical gaze. So if we look at birth through a medical gaze, and then doctors or physicians will label and view something as pathological so that they can legitimately lay claim to all the activities concerning that condition. So this medical gaze describes a medicalization of birth. If doctors can look at childbirth and pregnancy and say, this is pathological enough to come under our scope, to come under our purview, they can legitimately lay claim and take authority over childbirth. So under the medical gaze, certain cohorts in society are designated as either compliant or deviant and exhibiting good or bad behaviour. So if we comply with the authoritative knowledge and do what we're told by the expert, so in childbirth, if we agree that the doctor is correct and we comply with what they're recommending, then we would be labelled as good or compliant. But if we challenge it and we rebel against it, society would label us as bad or deviant. We would be the troublemakers. Anybody who rejects the authoritative knowledge is considered by society and the experts as deviant, troublemakers. This is a well-documented sociological phenomenon. I'm not just making this up. This is researched and commented on by anthropologists as a social phenomenon that occurs. So from a Foucauldian perspective, conformity to the medically defined norm is seen as good behaviour. So if we accept and comply with the authoritative way of doing things, then we're good. Society deems us as good. Now, things like the decision to give birth outside the system or challenge the current system can be understood as ways of escaping the medical gaze. And the women who do this, and midwives who do this, and other care providers who do this, are consciously or subconsciously labelled as deviant or rebels. So you may experience this when you demand or expect care that deviates from hospital policy. You might be labelled as the troublemaker for falling out of line and challenging the way things are done. People don't like it when we challenge the authoritative knowledge because they genuinely believe that they are right, that they understand correctly. And if you don't follow suit and if you don't also do what they think is right, then you're putting yourself in danger. The other reason why people don't like it when we challenge the authoritative knowledge is because they feel like you're telling them that they are wrong. If you don't believe what they believe, and they believe the authoritative things that most people believe, you're saying to them, you're wrong, and that's uncomfortable. In the paradigm proposed by Foucault, escaping the medical gaze would characterise us rebels, women, midwives, whoever you are, as social deviants. And there's another author, Nibs, who argues that compliance with authoritative knowledge produces the good citizen, and so anything that deviates from that would be a deviant citizen. So, what are we rebelling against? We're rebelling against the authoritative knowledge that society expects us to believe about birth, despite evidence showing us that the current authoritative knowledge is not right. Hospitals and medical ways of caring for birth are more and more being exposed as dangerous for women in so many ways, and not the safe haven of care that we are expected to believe. I'm saying this as a generalized statement, but we're seeing increasing levels of birth trauma, increasing levels of intervention, increasing levels of physical and emotional damage for women and babies. And much of it is iatrogenic, medically induced damage from birth. We are rebelling against dehumanization of women during childbirth, and we are rebelling against the lies told about pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. This podcast is about truth-telling. All of my work is about truth-telling. And the Convergence of Rebellious Midwives is a conference about truth-telling. Coming up in 3 weeks is the Convergence of Rebellious Midwives Conference. The title says it's for midwives, but it's for anyone who's interested in rebelling against the authoritative knowledge of the day. For people who are interested in truth-telling and who are interested in gathering knowledge that challenges the authoritative knowledge systems. We are being lied to about birth, and the Convergence is a place to join with other rebels, learn the truth about pregnancy and birth, gather your energy with other like-minded people who don't see you as deviant. This conference is happening in Sydney, Australia, in Darling Harbour from August 23rd to 25th, 2024. I've organised the most beautiful venue with nourishing food that honours your tired bodies. I've taken out the exhaustion and decision fatigue of other conferences by offering a single speaker roster where you get to hear everybody speak. The speakers are the most deviant, wise, and brave people that I could gather, including Dr. Sarah Buckley, Professor Hannah Darlin, Dr. Stu Fishbein from the US, Dr. Hazel Keedle, Jane Hardwick-Collins, Rhea Dempsey, Dr. Kirsten Small, Eleanor Mann, Dr. Athena Hammond, Dr. Elizabeth Newnham, Cheryl Sidery, Chief Midwife Alison Weatherstone, Dr. Sarah Ireland, Helen Gayupul Wangamara, and Maria Garawiwi, and myself. We have a yoga class, breathwork sessions, some serious partying opportunities to release all that pent-up stress, and I want to gift you with a rest and rejuvenate so that we can collectively keep rebelling against falsified authoritative knowledge together. There's still time to be part of the Convergence of Rebellious Midwives. Ticket sales close in 2 weeks on August 14th, and there are only 15 remaining tickets. I will be there, and I would love to meet you in person. Everyone is welcome. All the details about the conference and ticket sales are in the show notes below. To get free access to all the research that's used to create each podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. or you can join our members hub and financially support the work of this podcast. In the hub, you can ask me questions, and premium members get access to a monthly Q&A episode where I answer listener questions. You'll also get episode transcripts and additional resources for each podcast episode. All the details are in the show notes.